year ago I put keyboard against gamepad in 5 racing games, and this video is a follow-up to that. To recap, there wasn't a clear overall winner. Keyboard had a slight edge in games that favored fast inputs, while gamepad was slightly better in games that required precision. But there is one device that supposedly has the strengths of both and the weaknesses of none. Analog keyboards are said to be both fast and precise. Before we test that claim, let's clear up a crucial point. It seems that many people didn't understand the difference between analog and digital inputs, like this comment with 38 likes coming from someone who only watched 13 seconds of the video. I said it's impossible for digital keys to input values between 0 and 1, and this guy says,
there are keyboards that can do that by rooting.
show me a digital keyboard that inputs values between 0 and 1, I fucking dare you. I thought my brief explanation in the original video was unnecessary, but I guess not. If you like the most basic understanding of this concept, either close this video or ask ChatGPT to explain it to you. I'll also be addressing many other unhinged comments like this later into the video. Comments that eventually led me to spend $250 on a damn keyboard. Yeah, I didn't learn my lesson spending $300 on this circular disappointments. But let's get into why this Wu-Tang ADHD is expensive in the first place. It's the software, so let's check it out. You can use chapters to skip this one. Let's start with Wu-Tang's own specialized racing game profile. Bruh. It's terrible, so let's make our own. There aren't any racing games that natively support analog keyboards, so for this to work, the keyboard gives you the option to emulate either an X input device like the majority of gamepads, or a D input device like wheels and pedals. This is useful in games that treat gamepads and wheels differently. We then map the keys to our desire and disable keyboard input on keys with gamepad bindings on them, as some games can only accept inputs from one device at a time and you don't want overlapping anyway. Next step, the response curve applies to every analog access, so you're likely better off keeping it linear and adjust them separately with other tools if you want. The square gate output should also be enabled for games with flight controls. Gamepad wise, the Wu-Tang software has all the necessary features, but it's nowhere near complete in terms of extras. No software really is though. I use like 5 of them and there are still so many missing features I end up asking AI to write me a script for. One advantage of the gamepad is simply having much better grip and support. I can press any button without it significantly interfering with my trigger or stick modulation. On keyboard however, pressing any key will throw off my other fingers on the same hand much more than it does on the gamepad. For example, if I bind steering to left and right and shifting to up and down arrow keys, I find it difficult to steer accurately while simultaneously shifting. This can vary from person to person though, don't know how your fingers work. The other thing about the keyboard is how short the key travel distance is. I mean, what the hell did I expect? Each key on the Wu-Tang only has 4mm of actuation, whereas the analog sticks and triggers of Xbox style controllers have around double that. Before getting into the games, I should first mention that this keyboard does take some getting used to. It's been on and off, but I've had it for about half a year now and been using it more than the gamepad in racing games. While this video is far from a first impression, it is also not going to be as extensively and accurately tested as the original video. I didn't do as many practice runs and drove slightly safer in general. I don't think this one keyboard justifies a whole redo. I will be comparing it to a gamepad with Hall effect sticks and triggers, like the original video. Regular potentiometer sticks like the ones on OEM Xbox and PlayStation controllers have no place in 2025 if you actually care about accuracy, and unfortunately that is what most people have. Seriously, even 10% of stick drift can be a deal breaker in some games as we'll discover. We begin with Dirt Rally 2, the game that started it all. Despite the common belief, this game is more than playable on a digital keyboard. On a car and track combo with above average difficulty, gamepad turned out to be only a few tenths of a second faster per minute, and that is with all the assists turned off for both devices. Well, we're now gonna confirm what we already know. This time, we're taking a Mustang onto an ice track. Yes, spectators were run over in the 10 runs I completed for both gamepad and Wu-Tang. This combo emphasizes throttle control. Feel-wise, I wanted to say that Wu-Tang was less precise, but I wasn't sure. Despite the smaller range, I was still able to apply as much throttle as I wanted. But yapping aside, gamepad ultimately ended up with faster times by about 1/10 per minute. I decided to do a few runs with Wu-Tang in digital mode for lols and to see how big of a difference it made for this combo. And it was substantial. Digital mode's best run was over half a second per minute slower than analog's run, a gap far wider than the one between analog Wu-Tang and gamepad. So far Wu-Tang has held up really well against the pad, and it also has the advantage of arrow keys not being as sluggish to press as the analog stick. Watch the original video if you don't know why that's important. But in short, the vast majority of racing games smooth or filter your steering input on keyboard and gamepad devices. You press a key or tap the stick and the game starts to gradually turn the wheel for you, as opposed to instantly going to full lock. This is why analog steering inputs are useless in nearly every modern game. But what if they weren't? Like the original video, I'm gonna remove this filter and try out raw steering. For this one, I'm taking a snappy car on a road track. After 10 runs, the gap between the Wu-Tang and gamepad remained nearly the same. You might have expected Wu-Tang to perform slightly better here, since unlike throttle, you're getting double the range with steering on a Wu-Tang, as it is bound to 2 buttons now. Well, the Wooting has something else holding it back. It didn't make a big difference here, but we'll discuss it in another game where it'll become much more apparent. Overall, the Wooting can come very close to the gamepad when it comes to throttle and steering control in Dirt Rally 2. And unlike a normal keyboard, you're not forced to lock up your wheels every time you press the brakes. But still, these were extreme scenarios that amplified the need for analog inputs. This game is more than drivable on a normal keyboard, and you're not a god for beating its rubber banding AI. And the same goes for the fourth entry in the current most popular racing franchise. The steering is heavily filtered, and the majority of builds don't require considerable throttle control. But things get controversial when we get to braking. Without assists, brake input over 95% always results in a lockup in this game, while anything below that is always safe. For this reason, some people limit their brake input to 95% because there's literally no downside. That's what I did in the other video on the gamepad. For keyboard, I routed the inputs through a virtual controller, except I set the max braking to 95% instead of 100. I still had no analog control. Everything was either 0 or 100, and braking was either 0 or 95. You can see why some people might call this cheating, since one way to achieve this is with remapping tools. But the other way to limit your brake input is by simply using the physical trigger locks on Microsoft's own Elite 1 controller, a controller that people have used at Microsoft-owned events in a Microsoft game. Don't let certain games players find out about the existence of this controller. Okay, that will surely be the only time we go off topic in this video, but it was worth mentioning. Anyways, let's get to power building. The fastest overall road cars in this game are rear-wheel drive wheels with maximum power upgrades and relatively weak tire compounds. These cars are incredibly difficult to drive, and by that I mean it is difficult to keep them near the limit of traction and extract their true potential. Many people outright find them to be undrivable without assists. When it comes to throttle control, it doesn't get harder than this. Without intentionally ruining the car, of course. This time, the difference only became more noticeable. From the very first practice run, it was immediately apparent the Wooting was going to be at a disadvantage. By the end of 10 runs, the gap between the two devices was about twice as much as the last game. If there was any dev left over from Dirt Rally 2, it was all cleared up by now. The key on the Wooting is no match for the gamepad's trigger. However, it is still far better than digital inputs without using assists. Even with a short shifting strategy that trades in some consistency at the cost of potential, a regular keyboard is no match for either devices. I didn't bother testing balance builds, as the time difference was already marginal on those. They did force slightly different driving styles though, as where Wooting can give you more flexibility if you don't like tapping on a keyboard for example. Let's try a normal game now, like Wreckfest, the one that's actually complete. For some reason, this game increases your steering speed on digital buttons, but that won't stop keyboard from being at a disadvantage, because as usual, throttle is what matters. Key tapping isn't optimal in this game, but this isn't a power build or a Mustang on ice. Even Wooting's 4mm of key travel provides more than enough control here, so it wasn't surprising to see that the average times were almost the same for both devices. Gamepad did use a few more resets, but still, you can't pick a clear winner here. I'd personally go for the Wooting and say this is the game where it performs the best. I didn't try games that already favored quick digital inputs, because you can use an analog keyboard as a digital one and it'll perform just as good as any other keyboard. Or maybe even slightly better thanks to all the extra features. What's missing though is a 360-degree orbit cam. The Wooting software has a feature that lets you specify two zones on the same key and program them differently. Sadly, you can't customize the analog axis at all using this feature, and two zones doesn't cut it for digital buttons. You can still get two extra diagonals. I'm one of the only 20 people who plays arena-based modes, so I should stop. But we're not done yet. Here's a non-sim racing game that demands precise steering. This game is essentially unplayable with digital keyboards, as 100% input will instantly result in a loss of grip at medium to high speeds. With an analog keyboard, however, this is no longer a problem. Though this was the game where I noticed an issue with the keyboard. If you want full context, you have to watch another one of my videos here. But in short, small steering adjustments near the center are crucial in this game. Even seemingly small amounts of stick dead zone have a huge impact on the overall gameplay, and the Wooting does have some dead zone baked into it. I can very slightly press down on any key and have absolutely zero input show up. The software forces you to have a minimum dead zone of 0.1mm, but even that is a lie. According to this video, the actual dead zone is around 0.25 or about 6%. That is not good. I don't care about the potential noise, and the output is only 8-bit anyway, so let me set this as low as 0. Just like any good Hall Effect gamepad nowadays, it's one of their selling points. Had I known this, I wouldn't have bought this keyboard. Same with one of the most popular third-party gamepads, cause while everyone focuses so hard on the analog sticks, no one gives a shit about triggers. How the hell is no one mentioning this awful baked-in dead zone on the trigger? It's somehow worse than the previous model. Alright, I'm not gonna blame everything on the dead zone. The gamepad also has a much stronger feel for the joystick center. When trying to press keys as lightly as possible to steer, it's hard to know if I fully release the key for the opposite direction, which adds some inconsistency overall. The software has a feature to mitigate this, but it just swaps out the problem for another one. Going from a normal gamepad to a Hall effect one in this game felt like entering a new world. With this keyboard, however, I was thrown right back into the trash can. Even taking this game's incredibly punishing nature into account, the difference was so big that I gave up after only 6 runs with each device. At this point, I'm sure someone's gonna comment,
You should adjust the response curve. It makes a huge difference.
some people act like input curve is like a magical fix that makes every racing game infinitely better. Just shut up! All it does is give you slightly more accuracy towards the center for less accuracy towards the end of the stick, or vice versa. And this only affects the input value, don't mistake it for things like the steering rate. Input curve has practically no effect on games with strong smoothing, and is certainly not going to make games with bad physics any more playable. It's situational, and mostly comes down to personal preference in the end. Well, this is actually the perfect situation to apply a curve. Sensitive steering on a combo that cares about nothing but near center accuracy. Well, you do need high inputs for 3 corners in the first lap, this is where the curve shows its weakness, but everywhere else, the impact was significant. Well, not significant enough to beat the gamepad time still, and this won't work for every combo, it's just an extreme example. So extreme that with a simple trick, I can triple my accuracy, completely eliminate the chance of losing traction, while still having the option to instantly switch back to the default curve, and destroy my gamepad times with insane consistency. More on this later. Fortunately for keyboard and gamepad manufacturers, racing games like this are no longer made. Or are they? Here comes Tokyo Extreme Racer, a game that despite offering smoothing options, feels incredible to play with raw steering on a gamepad. There's no proper way to test it though. Not only does the traffic add randomness, but measuring time in it takes more effort than I'm willing to put into this video. Unlike F-Zero though, raw steering with Wooting was perfectly usable. The dead zone was still noticeable and certainly made the steering twitchier, but it wasn't a deal breaker overall. This keyboard is targeted towards esports and competitive gaming, but let's be real, you won't find any big competitions in racing games. The most popular racing game esports is not even in the top 50 when it comes to prize pools. Even within the genre, the top games are designed for and dominated by wheels. The competitive racing game community is simply way too small relative to other genres, hence why there's so little information on topics like this. And even when there is, it's usually coming from people who know nothing about the genre, which results in a lot of garbage. Wu-Tang himself has showcased this keyboard in 3 racing games. One of them is FM7, a game where its clown show esports took place on consoles with gamepads. One of them is Burnout, a franchise with some of the easiest driving physics. And the last one is Trackmania, where they showcase a now banned feature of the keyboard. A feature you can also find in free remapping tools and don't have to waste $200 on. These non-racing game people gotta understand that each game is built differently. You can't pick literally any racing game and expect analog inputs to make a difference. Similarly, wheels are not the definitive device to play every racing game with. These are simply different game controllers offering various degrees of speed, accuracy, and feedback for the same type of inputs. Yeah, don't forget that wheel is short for steering wheel game controller. You'd also be hard-pressed to find racing games where all devices perform closely, which is one of the many reasons as to why I didn't include wheels in my comparisons. So in conclusion, analog keyboards, are they worth it for racing games? Well, I'd say absolutely not. Sure, the Wooting gives you all the advantages of a regular keyboard, with most of the advantages of a gamepad, but at what cost? You can buy a Hall effect gamepad and a mechanical keyboard for less than 1/3 the price and outperform Wooting in any racing game. But what about cheaper Hall effect keyboards? Well, many of them don't even come with gamepad emulation. Or at least no one mentions it, because apparently everyone's buying these to better strafe in shooters. Like come on, has nobody tried this in Rocket League? People hyping up these things like they're the future of keyboards. Stop, no. Not when they're overpriced, glorified digital keyboards in practice, with no standards whatsoever. Force feedback wheels used to have great compatibility when they all use the same API, and now every wheel manufacturer is doing their own thing, resulting in the mess that you see today. Have you ever noticed that whenever someone mentions their wheel online, more often than not they're trying to troubleshoot it? It's always something like the wheel isn't recognized, my pedals don't work, or force feedback isn't right. Wheels have a less than 15% market share among my viewers, but if you look at Discord channels, that number feels more like 70% with how much of a compatibility disaster wheels are. I personally had to build a DIY adapter and ask someone to program it just so one of the best-selling wheels could be used in games made before 2020. Anyways, the Wooting related things are over. Yeah, you might have realized by now that this video isn't actually about Wooting, that's just an excuse to ramble about random racing game related stuff. For the rest of the video, I'll be responding to many of the interesting comments people wrote in my previous video. I covered a controversial topic that most people had a misconception about, so I really should have expected the comment section to become a dumpster fire of Dunning-Kruger effect. Disclaimer, this is gonna come off as a roast session, but I also want to clear up any ambiguity regarding my previous video, and there will be some fun topics in between. It's gonna sound like rage bait with the way I present it, but that's genuinely not my intention and never has been. Not all the comments are as mean as I make them out to be. Let's begin.
It's not about being faster, it's about comfort, and controllers much more fun. Not to mention it's more realistic.
You can also find comments of people saying the opposite, so personal preference. Also, it is about being faster. Why else do you think click slip stereotypes are so common?
I beat Dirt Rally in the hardest championship with just a keyboard. I beat Dirt Rally 2's single-player campaign on a keyboard. I've actually completed this game with a digital keyboard, something I'm proud of. And rightfully so.
In many cases, they're trying to imply that they're playing at a disadvantage when they're actually not. Hell, there exists a six-figure channel built on the premise of playing racing games with keyboard. It's literally in every video's description dating back a decade. And big surprise, all the games played are keyboard friendly. Wait, he has some TXR videos. Oh, of course he's playing that one with a wheel. I'm only now noticing this extreme level of aura farming. Not looking for drama, disclaimer. I also don't get the more realistic argument. Playing a video game with either device is so far from driving a real car, it's not even worth comparing. Even wheel setups are far from the real thing, I'd argue. People only tend to compare the vehicle physics and input device feel and not the overall experience.
Why didn't you test sim racing games like BeamNG and Assetto Corsa?
Most of these games are designed to be used with wheels and wheels only, making it the obvious, superior option. Other devices are, at best, an afterthought. So the keyboard versus gamepad comparison is pointless here when we know both are gonna suck. And let's be real, had I tested those games, you would instead be commenting,
Why would you play sim games with anything but a wheel?
so shut the fuck up!
But there are many controller players in sim racing.
Yeah, and you should take a look at what they're doing in those games. Half of them are drifting and cruising around Assetto Corsa's mod maps, and the other half are crashing cars in BeamNG. Let me clarify again. No one's seriously racing in sims with keyboard or controller.
But there are fast controller players in sim racing.
Fast, by your definition, is likely around 4 seconds off pace. What matters is that the fastest people in sims are all using wheels. Gamepad players can in theory match them in time attacks, but they don't have the consistency in a race. They wear out their tires quicker and can't catch oversteer for shit. Keyboard and gamepad are simply not competitive in sim racing and can drive on the edge of the limits. If you believe otherwise, you're most certainly underdriving the car. And if you're a wheel user, maybe you should stop spreading bullshit misinformation about devices you don't use and have no experience on. Okay, the last two were in actual comments, but they would have been if I didn't address them right away.
What about Trackmania?
I didn't include it for the reasons already explained in the video at the conclusion. It's almost as if you miss some context if you don't have enough attention span to watch more than 15 seconds of a 15-minute video. Many comments came from people watching only a small portion, making false conclusions, and blaming the video as a result. But I'll go over it anyway. I stayed away from games that are still receiving updates, cause updates can change things. As you can see, I don't like having to constantly make update videos every time Ubisoft inevitably fucks something up, as they did with both The Crew and TM. 4 out of the 5 games in the original video had all hit their final update, but were still fairly relevant. Hopefully you now see why. I also don't get the enthusiasm of BeamNG players, a game that will never come out of early access, and most people treat it solely as a crash simulator. It's not like you can race in it either, if you don't have a NASA CPU. Well, I actually did try one of its hardest missions, but didn't include it because it was mostly for lols. It felt like it was dependent on luck more than anything else. I went full send in each run, and switching back and forth between devices each time I crashed and had to reset. Gamepad looked better on paper, finishing on 11th and 20th attempt, while keyboard only got there at the 30th. But both devices did what I wanted them to really. I switched to digital mode out of curiosity and ended up finishing in the first attempt. Though admittedly, it also forced me to go a lot slower and ended up with a 30-second gap to the other runs. Hope you're happy now, don't know what you expected. I didn't use any assists despite the game's decent offerings. That actually would have been more interesting to play around with if BeamNG wasn't an unfinished tech demo. One of the assists doesn't work and one is outright defective. Speaking of assists,
Try to play on keyboard without assists like ABS and traction control.
that's what I did. No assists were used for most of the comparisons. If they were, it was either because the game forced them on or they provided way more advantages than disadvantages, making them the meta choice for competitive play. I even directly discussed assists in the original video, so I don't get why some comments imply that I was completely clueless about them.
Keyboard versus controller is a whole can of worm at Trackmania.
Not as much as you think. Another big misconception I commonly come across stems from Trackmania. Many people think TM is like the most complex, in-depth, analog-sensitive game in the racing genre, when in reality, it's actually on the simpler side. First of all, TM doesn't even support analog for axle and diesel, so we're only talking about the steering here. And for that, we have an incredibly handy channel that uploads TM world records with input overlays. And we can see that in most of them, people are just tap steering left and right. There exists cars in this game where analog steering is the whole gimmick, but as we can see on this channel once again, those cars are way less popular. I wonder why? Also, we're talking about optimized time attacks here, so in practice, analog inputs are even less important than what's shown here.
But look at how TM is trying to balance keyboard and controller.
Well, in that case, maybe they should have tried a proven solution implemented by Literally every other racing game.
Why don't you put your money where your mouth is and win a GT7 tournament with keyboard?
Can you even play GT7 on a keyboard? Also, why would I put time and money in tournaments that have basically zero prize pool? That's such a terrible investment. Still better than Horza though, where you get to race against likely cheaters and confirmed glitch abusers. The latter of which Turton and Dodgitech badly tried to cover up. As usual.
You were slower with the gamepad because you're treating it like a keyboard. You should be smooth with the analog stick.
Smoothly steering is pointless when the game is already smoothing your inputs. In most cases, especially in modern games, you want to steer at the same speed or faster than what the game allows you to. It can still be beneficial in non-analog sensitive games, but those cases are rare and only result in marginally faster times in time attacks. Okay, I don't want to leave room for ambiguity this time, so let me clarify this point that I also made at the end of TM and Sims. Time trials and races demand different driving styles. One is about pace, the other is about consistency. Believe it or not, things get a lot different when you don't have unlimited attempts to run a perfect lap. Let's try to explain it using a common example. To set fast times, you need to come as close to the track limits as possible. This limit could be a wall. In a race, you'll leave a bit of space between you and the wall so you don't risk crashing into it, because a crash would be costly. If you come too close to the wall, you make a sudden input to steer away and maintain a safe distance. In a time attack, however, that is not even an option. Correcting means losing time. That means your run is less optimized, so you reset. The next time you don't turn away, you come even closer to the wall but end up pushing too hard and crash into it. No problem. Just reset and repeat the process until you manage one optimized run. The quick counter steer that you never see in time attack is what saves you from crashing in a race. Many of these analog sensitive time attacks boil down to minimizing your input changes, and good luck doing that when you're about to get spun out or go off the track. One part I ended up cutting out of the video because of less than expected attention span was that I was going for consistently fast times, not just the fastest possible lap. I noted down how many runs I invalidated due to a fatal error, cause they matter. That's why I take anything coming out of the keyboard of time attack only players with a grain of salt.
You're supposed to roll the analog stick, not just tap it left and right.
Roll steering is the act of pushing the analog stick to the top edge and rolling it around its housing to steer. Roll steering is simply personal preference. It isn't noticeably more precise and lacks accurate recentering on circular joystick gates. But hey, according to this guy, roll steering is the best thing ever.
Which I think will eventually become a standard because it's so good. I think it's great. It's absolutely amazing for a game like this, but I do think it's a game changer. It's excellent. I love it. It's excellent. I love it. Fairly new way of treating analog input in order to steer a vehicle.
People have been roll steering since the N64 days. It's not like you can't do micro adjustments by smooth taps on an accurate analog stick like the one on N64. Wait a minute, how could someone with 64 in his username, making what he thinks is a heavily F-Zero inspired game, already not know about this? Just pointing out a small red flag here, because this thing raised 100k and has a small but very dedicated community that simps extremely hard over it. To be fair, the formula he uses is the technically correct way to implement roll steering, but it's hardly an improvement over simply not having it, and is nowhere near the game changer he makes it out to be. Funnily enough, the person who wrote the formula has a much more interesting one that we'll get to shortly.
Try driving slow on a keyboard.
You don't have to try to do that. But in all seriousness, he's likely referring to cruising being easier with a gamepad. And yeah, gamepad is the better option if your goal is to stay as close to 40 kph as possible. Much fun!
You can just remap your controls to face buttons on the gamepad and have the same advantage as keyboard.
Not quite. Using two fingers on the left and right arrow keys will always be faster than using one finger on a D-pad. Try rapidly switching between left and right on both keyboard and D-pad and the difference becomes quite obvious. Same with Axel and Diesel on A and X. It's still slower than if you're using both of your hands on keyboard, which you should if you're serious about keyboarding in racing games. Have your Axel and Diesel on one hand and steering on the other. The default layouts like arrow keys or WASD aren't a good idea, as you'll have all the primary inputs on one hand and have to move your finger to access other keys. With a two-handed layout, you're completely getting rid of the time it takes for your fingers to travel between the primary input keys. I hope that was a clear enough explanation. The only way to match this with gamepads is either with weird bindings on certain custom controllers or by using the claw grip on PS-style gamepads, a method known to be incredibly taxing on the wrists and fingers. Or you could stop trying to be a smartass and use the keyboard you already have. So overall, keyboard does not equal D-pad in practice.
Of course arcade games made for kids don't differ. Actual sim racing games require car control precision down to the last decimal.
You're saying that when the most popular class in sim racing is modern GT cars with ABS and traction control. Additionally, most racing games use the same physics principles, so them claiming to be more realistic doesn't necessarily mean they need more accuracy. You saw two games in this video that are proof of that. So just to clarify to elitist sim racers, perceived realism has nothing to do with the racing game's difficulty, skill ceiling, or required precision.
What about mouse steering or wheels?
My goal was to compare the two most popular devices. Furthermore, I haven't been using the wheel as much since it's been such a turn off for me, and even if I did have the experience, I can guarantee half the comments would be people complaining about the tests not being done on a 4-figure direct drive rig. They don't even sell those here, and importing some big ass heavy wheels will cost far more than a plastic keyboard. As for mice, literally no one takes mouse steering seriously. No racing game implements it properly. I touched on this in another video, but still, if enough people find this video interesting, I could waste another $250 on this mouse with analog buttons and gyro, then dive into different types of mouse steering. I already watched a video of someone using it in FH5 and couldn't help but cringe when they understeer with every mouse turn. That thing is not set up correctly.
Wheel's obviously going to be superior.
But there exists a far more interesting device: steering dials. Unfortunately, we only have 3 options for those. Overpriced manufactured e-waste with only 180 degrees of rotation, DIY projects that cost thousands of dollars worth of equipment to make, and finally, improvising with winding stick steering on regular gamepads, a steering method that seemingly no one knows about. It's like roll steering, except you get a lot more steering range, like as much as a normal wheel. Yep, you can set it to 1800 degrees to get insane accuracy, and more importantly, it auto-centers when you let go. This sounds simple, yet genius on paper, so how comes no one's ever tried it? Well, probably because it kinda sucks in practice. I tried wind steering with BeamNG to see how well it would perform, and it was terrible. Well, I was terrible. This is something you have to put a lot of time in and get used to. But still, one huge problem with this method is that you have no idea how much you're steering. You know why the few people who unironically play sims with a controller use a cockpit view? It's not for immersion, it's because they're trying to make up for the lack of physical feedback with a visual one. Even the developer of this method reached the same conclusion and built an overlay. But even with it, things are only moderately improved. Sure, I can cruise around at low speeds just fine, but driving at the limit without spinning out doesn't seem possible. I had much more success with plain simple raw steering. Still, I'm surprised those sim racing gamepad players don't already know about this. It's the same story with self-centering mouse steering. As if you needed any more proof that no one cares about gamepads in sim racing. Or even in truck sims, this thing should at least be as standard in those. Another factor that likely contributed to this method's obscurity is its lack of accessibility. There's code, but how do you use it with remapping tools? Thankfully we have language models these days to take care of that. Yeah, don't ask me how to set up any of the mess you see in this video. If you need help, AI is your friend. For now, the most effective method to improve gamepad's accuracy in sims is to introduce a modifier. Multiply the x-axis input by something like 50% and then use a separate button to instantly return it to its normal 100% state when held down. You're basically doubling the accuracy this way, something you can never hope to achieve with just an input curve. With many cars and sims, you don't need high steering luck outside of counter steering or slow hairpins, so this method works great on those, and I know at least Rennsport has something similar. As an example, I tried this in a game I was stuck on, playing with raw steering on the Wu-Ting, and managed to drastically improve my consistency and times. I set a 0.5 multiplier to get more precision in medium and high speed corners, and then held the modifier button to get full standard range in low speed corners. That's what I did in F-Zero as well, just with a 1/3 multiplier. The Wu-Ting software also has a feature where you can use an axis as a makeshift modifier key. Of course, this method isn't optimal overall. It requires an extra button and only improves the accuracy for the initial part of the input. It only exists because sim racing games don't bother improving their gamepad support. Like, how about centering the wheel to the car's trajectory like a real car? No one cares about gamepads in sim racing. This alone significantly increases the viability of wind steering, though I still found it inferior to raw steering. And don't call it oversteer assist, that's how it should be by default. Actually, this way I can say wheel users are noobs who can't play racing games without oversteer assist. Just kidding, okay? But hey, wheel users shit on other devices all the time for needing assist, when they are the ones always using assist that other devices lack in certain games.
You are far away from being a pro, meaning a lot of your data is probably polluted with skill issue. This should be done with the best players.
Good luck finding a more qualified person willing to put the effort for YouTube money. And you probably don't want to ask the crowd whose job is to mislead and gatekeep info, unless they're retired. I don't want to say I'm an expert on this topic, but I sure as hell have way more experience than anyone in this comment section. My thousands of hours of playing Comp Horza and winning official prize events must mean something, right?
You reached the skill ceiling in FS in 50 hours tops, so yeah, it was largely for nothing.
Well, that's still more than modern GT3 cars in any sim, so, in your own words, 2 out of 10 rage bait.
I also won prized events in ACC, yet I'm nowhere near the top.
That's a confusing statement. You're either at the top winning prized events, or you're nowhere near it, winning events that have a prize pool of 5 liras. You did win one thing for sure though, and that is the award for the dumbest comment on my video. Congrats! Okay, roast session over. In another video I showcase how exploitable clutch is in racing games. I then got many comments saying how BeamNG actually addresses this. But not only what they describe doesn't address it, it took me less than 20 minutes of in-game remapping to completely cheese BeamNG's clutch and shifting. Come on, this is basic stuff, it really isn't hard to figure out. I was surprised to find no other remotely scientific keyboard versus controller test for racing games. Not even for the game where it supposedly matters, so that's why I did mine. You shouldn't take the word of a random anonymous dude on the internet for granted though. I linked the full results in the description and was disappointed to see that at best, only a handful of the 300,000 people who watched the video bothered to double check that, illustrating how little interest and development exists on this topic in general. No one cares about racing games.